Tonight, let me guide you into the darkest realm of ancient mythology. A world beneath the earth, ruled by the god who commands the dead. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Now take a deep breath, close your eyes, and descend with me into the underworld. In the beginning of all things, when the world was young and the heavens were first raised above the earth, there were 3 brothers born of the great Titans, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. They were not yet gods of thunder, sea, and death, but forces of raw, untamed power shaped by chaos and destiny. When they rose against their father Cronus and shattered the age of the Titans, they divided the world among themselves. Zeus took the sky, bright and vast, filled with storm and light. Poseidon claimed the sea, deep and restless, forever moving. And Hades received what no other desired, the realm beneath the earth, the silent kingdom of the dead. This was not a curse, though many believed it to be. It was a responsibility heavier than any crown. For while the living laughed beneath the sun, someone had to guard what awaited them in the end. Someone had to ensure that order existed even beyond the final breath. The underworld was not born of fire or torment. It was shaped from stone, mist, and memory. Vast caverns stretched endlessly, carved not by hands but by time itself. Rivers of dark water wound through shadowed valleys, carrying the whispers of countless souls. These were not screams of pain, but echoes of lives once lived. Regrets, dreams, unfinished thoughts that clung to existence like mist the cold earth. Hades ruled from a throne carved of obsidian, seated in a hall so ancient that even the walls seemed to breathe with forgotten ages. He did not rule with cruelty. He did not scream or punish. He ruled with silence, with law, with inevitability. In his realm, nothing was chaotic. Nothing was wasted. Everything ended as it must. The souls of mortals passed before him like falling leaves. Kings and farmers, warriors and poets, children and elders. In death, none were greater than another. Hades watched them without judgment, because judgment was not his task. His role was not to decide their worth, but to receive what time had taken. Above him, the world turned. Seasons shifted. Kingdoms rose and fell. Generations lived and disappeared like waves on sand. Hades remained, always watching, always waiting. The Olympian gods rarely spoke his name. To mention him was to remember death, and gods, despite their immortality, despised a thought of endings. They called him distant, cold, heartless, but none of them understood the weight he carried. He knew every ending. He remembered every soul. Yet even within this duty, solitude grew. time in the underworld moved differently. There were no sunrises or sunsets, no warmth, no wind. Only an eternal, unmoving twilight. Even the rivers seemed to flow without sound. The silence was not loud, it was absolute. Hades began to feel the shape of eternity pressing against him. Not pain, not anger, something worse. Emptiness. Cerberus, the three-headed guardian, walked endlessly through the halls, his claws echoing on stone. He was loyal, tireless, eternal like his master. But he was not a companion. He was a symbol of the border between living and dead. Hades walked the banks of the Styx alone. He looked into the waters and saw not reflections, but memories, faces of mortals who had passed through his halls. Faces of joy and sorrow, love and fear. And yet, none of these emotions belonged to him. He was a god, and gods do not live. They endure. Far above, something changed. A new presence had entered the world of the living. Not new in birth, but new in awareness. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, began to walk the earth not as a child, but as a being touched by her own quiet power. Wherever she stepped, plants twisted toward the light. Flowers opened, the soil softened. Hades felt it like a tremor through the foundations of his realm. A disturbance in the stillness. He did not know her. He had never seen her. And yet the existence of such life made the silence of his world feel heavier. He observed from the depths, through shadows, through ancient cracks in the fabric of the world. He saw her move through golden fields, laugh among green hills, sit beside rivers of clear water. She did not know she was being watched. She did not know that the god of endings had felt something shift because of her presence. What Hades felt was not hunger. It was not conquest. It was recognition. He realized that existence had given him a mirror, not of darkness, but of light, a balance he had never touched. The underworld responded as he did. Shadows stretched further. The rivers slowed, then quickened. Even the old stone seemed to tighten with anticipation. For the first time since the fall of the Titans, Hades felt the future move, and it moved in the direction of the living. But destiny is not gentle, and when it begins to turn, even gods are carried with it. The world above continued to shimmer with life, unaware that deep below something ancient had begun to awaken. While mortals tended to their fields and gods lounged upon marble thrones, Hades remained in silent observation, measuring the delicate movement of fate as it began to drift closer to the surface. He did not rise in a sudden act of rage or desire. This was not the nature of the god of the dead. His movements were slow, deliberate, shaped by centuries of restraint. But now, beneath that restraint, something unspoken had taken root. Curiosity. It spread through him like a slow-burning fire that never flared, only warmed the cold of eternity. Through the thin veil, that separated realms. He watched Persephone in moments of stillness, when the world itself seemed to pause around her. He saw her kneeling beside wildflowers, her fingers brushing kettles, as though she understood that every fragile bloom carried a story. She walking barefoot across grass warmed by the sun, her hair threading light into the air itself. Each movement she made disturbed the silence he had lived within. The more he observed, the clearer it became. She represented what his world lacked, and perhaps what it had always needed. In time, his quiet attention turned into resolve. Not a violent decision, nor an impulsive one, but an acceptance of something he could no longer ignore. Fate, which even the gods were bound to obey, had drawn a line from the deepest shadow to the brightest field. And Hades stepped toward it. The earth above cracks open in a meadow untouched by fear or darkness. The fracture was not an explosion, but a silent spitting of worlds. Roots were pulled into the deep, stones rolled outward. In a blink of a heartbeat, Persephone fell from the warmth of the sun into the cold breath of the earth. Darkness did not harm her. It embraced her. The underworld rose around her like an ancient cathedral, formed from pillars of stone that held the weight of forgotten time. The air was thick, heavy, still. Shadows did not move aggressively. They simply existed, stretching without end. Fear came first, her breath shallow, her body tense, not because she had been attacked, but because she had been taken from all she knew. Above her was no sky, beneath her only stone and distance. Meanwhile, Hades watched from a distance that felt infinite and yet painfully small. He did not approach her as a conqueror. He did not treat her as a prisoner. He observed, he measured. He felt the presence of something in his kingdom that had never walked its halls before. Life, not as memory, but as presence. And the underworld changed. The rivers grew restless, their surfaces trembling as though disturbed by a silent wind. The silent halls echoed faintly with sounds unheard for eternity. Even the stones, ancient and unmoved, seemed to lean inward toward her presence. Above, something began to wither. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, felt the disappearance of her daughter, as if the earth itself had torn a wound through her chest. She searched tirelessly, through forests, through mountains, across plains and rivers, but Persephone had slipped beyond the reach of the sun. Grief turned into wrath, and wrath reshaped the world. The soil hardened. Seeds refused to sprout. Crops that once rose tall collapsed into dust. Trees shed their leaves as though mourning something unseen. Rivers shrank. Clouds withheld rain. The world began to starve. Mortals fell to their need in prayer, but the sky remained silent. The fields remained bare. The earth had turned its back on life. The gods of Olympus felt the consequences of mortal suffering. Temples emptied. Offerings ceased. The power of faith began to weaken. Zeus, ruler of the sky, could no longer ignore the imbalance. He did not descend in fury. He did not strike down the earth. Instead, he felt the slow understanding of a truth he had hoped to deny. the world could not survive without Persephone. In the underworld, time continued its strange, unbroken flow. Persephone moved slowly through dark corridors, exploring the quiet vastness around her. At first, fear dominated her thoughts, but fear slowly shifted into something else. Understanding. She observed the souls of the dead and realized they did not suffer. They wandered like leaves in still water, resting, remembering, and letting go. This realm was not a place of torment. It was a place of ending, and endings were not always cruel. Hades felt something unfamiliar. Regret. Not for taking her, but for knowing that the world above was breaking because of it. He had not wanted destruction. He had wanted equilibrium. Yet now, equilibrium was shattering. For the first time, the god of the dead felt the weight of choice. A single act had moved the fate of everything. Fate does not ask permission. It only demands payment. And the cost of this moment had only begun to reveal itself. Above the underworld, the earth itself began to tremble with absence. Fields that once waved like golden seas now lay barren. Trees stood as skeletal reminders of life withdrawn. Rivers that had sung for centuries dwindled to trickles, and the wind carried nothing but the hollow echoes of despair. Mortals stumbled through parched lands, their prayers echoing into the void, unanswered. They did not understand that the world had been split between life and death. Nor did they know that the threads of fate were pulled by forces beyond their comprehension. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, walked the lands like a shadow herself. Her grief was palpable, a storm that darkened skies and stripped warmth from the soil. Every flower that had once bloomed beneath her care now lay dead. Every crop refused to grow. Even the forests, the densest and most resilient, could not resist the mourning of a mother robbed of her child. Her sorrow moved through the world like an invisible frost, seeping into every corner where life might have flourished. Hades observed this from his throne of shadows, silent yet aware. He did not rejoice in the suffering above. He understood it, as a doctor understands the pain of a wound. He had drawn Persephone to him, yes, but he had not intended to unravel the balance of the living world so violently. Every decision in his realm carried weight beyond the underworld's borders, yet he had acted with what seemed inevitability. Fate is neither cruel nor kind, it simply is. Within the cavernous halls of the underworld, Persephone wandered, her senses adjusting to the unfamiliar realm. She was aware of the change in the world above, though not fully of its extent. The rivers of shadow and silence murmured beneath her feet, and the dead watched without interference. She began to understand the nature of this place. It was not meant to be feared. It was meant to endure. It was a realm of permanence, the final stage of existence. Yet within it, life could be perceived in quiet, subtle ways. Memories and echoes formed patterns, and the souls themselves had learned a kind of calm within their endless wandering. Hades watched her movement carefully, noting her quiet comprehension. He did not approach, for even a god of death knew the weight of presence. He understood that nothing could be forced in matters of the heart or spirit, and yet the balance had already been disturbed. Persephone's arrival had set in motion ripples that extended far beyond the halls of stone and shadow. The skies above darkened further as Demeter's mourning deepened. Crops shriveled and died in fields that had once been fertile. Rivers, which had sung of life for millennia, fell silent. Animals, sensing the imbalance, grew restless. Humans prayed, but their prayers dissolved into the emptiness, unheard. The world began to teeter on the edge of collapse, and the gods felt the strain of disrupted order. Zeus, observing the chaos, recognized that mortal survival depended on the restoration of balance. He understood that the intervention must occur, yet he also recognized the gravity of Hades' claim. The Underworld was his realm, and Persephone had entered it not through force of malice, but through the inevitability of fate. A negotiation was required, though it would not be simple. The threads of choice, desire, and duty were tangled, and only careful resolution could prevent catastrophe. In the Underworld, Persephone continued to explore, moving with caution and curiosity. The shadows did not pursue. The air did not close in. Instead, she sensed a presence behind every stone, a vigilant guardianship that reminded her she was never truly alone. Slowly, she began to understand the structure of this kingdom. Here, life and death were intertwined in subtle patterns, cycles of observation, remembrance, and acceptance. Every soul she encountered carried a story, and every story seemed to form the rhythm of the realm. Hades reflected on the nature of endings. Mortals feared him because they feared the unknown, but endings were not always an absence of care. They were completion, the last note in the song that all life sang. And yet, he understood that his decisions could resonate beyond his immediate domain. Persephone's presence had not only altered the balance of the living world, but had also revealed to him the power of connection, even in his endless solitude. The underworld began to shift subtly in response to her presence. Shadows stretched in new directions, stones and walls realigned with imperceptible changes, and the rivers murmured with a different cadence. For the first time, the realm responded not only to the dead, but also to the living. And through it all, Hades remained in his eternal observation, aware that the ripples of one life could transform even a god's domain. Above, the world continued to falter under the weight of absence. The famine spread across kingdoms, and the mortals' despair deepened. Demeter's grief was both natural and divine, a force of devastating power that no single god could oppose. Even Zeus, in his wisdom and authority, understood that intervention required subtlety and respect for the immutable laws of existence. And so, the tension between life and death, light and shadow, order and chaos grew to a climax that neither realm could ignore. The fate of mortals, the balance of nature, and the eternal rule of Hades were now inseparably intertwined. From this nexus of inevitability, a path forward would have to emerge, shaped by compromise, understanding, and the inexorable hand of destiny itself. The world above trembled under Demeter's sorrow. Crops withered, rivers dried, and winds carried a hollow silence where once life had sung. The mortals, once busy in their daily labours, now wandered aimlessly, their prayers swallowed by the emptiness of the sky. Entire villages grew quiet, and the laughter of children was replaced by a whisper of despair. Nature itself seemed suspended, holding its breath as though awaiting a resolution that had not yet arrived. The Olympians convened, a council of power and concern, far removed from the silent halls of the underworld. Zeus observed the disruption, weighing the suffering of the living against the immutability of Hades' domain. His brow furrowed with the awareness that the laws of fate, older than any command he could issue, were unyielding. Mortals suffered, yes, but the underworld had its own inexorable order, and Persephone's presence there was not an act of cruelty, but one of inevitable consequence. In the depths of the underworld, Hades continued his quiet observation of Persephone. She had begun to move with a tentative grace, learning to navigate the halls and corridors carved from the ancient stone of the world's foundation. She observed the rivers, the shadows, the silent movement of souls, and in her eyes there flickered a mixture of wonder, fear, and an emerging comprehension. Hades, even from his throne, noted the subtle transformation of the realm in response to her presence. The shadows stretched differently. The air carried a different cadence, and the rivers seemed to murmur in a tone attuned to life rather than mere endings. Time flowed differently in the underworld. Days, months, and years were abstract concepts, irrelevant to a place without sunlight or seasons. Yet even in such a timeless realm, the ripples of mortal life above could be sensed. Hades understood that Persephone's arrival had created a bridge between worlds, fragile yet unbreakable, which linked the vitality of life with the permanence of death. This realization did not fill him with fear, but it awakened a new awareness, one he had not felt in countless centuries of solitude. Persephone's exploration of the underworld revealed subtle signs of order and care. The dead were not left to wander aimlessly. Their paths were guided, their endings acknowledged. Hades' rule, though distant and quiet, was not indifferent. Everything in this kingdom served a purpose, yet in her presence, those purposes seemed to align with something beyond inevitability, something almost alive. She noticed the smallest shifts in the shadows, the way the stone seemed to soften under her gaze, and she understood, without words, that the underworld itself was responsive. Above, the famine deepened. Mortals wandered in desperation, and temples, once full of offerings and prayers, now stood empty. Demeter's grief was no longer contained. It was a force of divine magnitude, reshaping the very earth. Zeus, despite his mastery of storms and thunder, recognized the fragility of balance. Intervention could not be simple. It could not be forced. The underworld was sovereign, and Hades' dominion was as absolute as it was eternal. Hermes, messenger of the gods, prepared to descend, carrying not threats, but the possibility of negotiation. Hades, from his throne, perceived the approach not as intrusion, but as inevitability. He had no need to act hastily, for the laws of the underworld were patient. The very stones beneath his feet waited for eternity. They could wait a little longer. Persephone's presence, however, continued to alter the rhythm of this ancient realm. The rivers that had flowed silently for centuries now carried an almost imperceptible hum. Shadows shifted with a subtle intelligence, avoiding the disturbance she caused, yet responding to her curiosity. Even Cerberus, vigilant and eternal, softened his approach, sensing the vitality he brought. The very air of the underworld seemed to breathe in new patterns, responding to her, acknowledging her, without violating the natural order. In this quiet transformation, Hades felt a rare moment of reflection. He realized that the permanence he had always known was not opposed to change. The arrival of Persephone did not diminish his rule, it enriched it. The underworld was still a kingdom of endings, yet in her presence it became a realm of continuity. Death and life intertwined in ways previously unseen, and Hades understood that balance did not require absence of presence. Instead, it demanded recognition, subtle guidance, and a patient hand. Above, the mortals waited, their suffering unending but not unnoticed. The famine pressed, and yet the gods were mindful. Even in crisis, there was order. The cycles of life and death, though disrupted, were not broken. Persephone would not remain solely in one world. Fate, ever careful, would ensure her dual existence. But seeds of compromise had already been sown, though neither the living nor the dead could yet perceive them. The first steps toward understanding had begun. Persephone, moving through shadows and rivered corridors, began to see the patterns of the underworld. Hades observed, patient and unwavering, noting every adjustment, every flicker of awareness in her expression. Their worlds, once separate, had begun the subtle weaving of connection. The living and the dead, light and shadow, joy and grief, all moved toward a nexus of resolution, though the final path was not yet visible. And so, the stage was set. The underworld remained eternal, the surface world fragile. Persephone's presence had created tension and transformation, and the gods above began to perceive that balance required not dominion, but negotiation. The inevitability of fate had been disturbed, yet it remained unbroken. From this point forward, every movement, every choice, every breath of life and shadow would carry the weight of consequence, weaving together the story that had begun in silence and would continue across worlds. The world above had grown restless. Fields lay barren, rivers shrank, and the wind carried the soundless cries of those abandoned by the bounty of the earth. Mortals, driven by desperation, stumbled through empty landscapes, their prayers drifting unanswered toward the heavens. Even the Olympians, accustomed to the flow of life and death, felt unease ripple through their immortal senses. Balance, so long assumed and unquestioned, had begun to falter. Hades remained in the depths, watching, observing, understanding the consequences of a single act. The presence of Persephone in his realm. He did not act with aggression, for aggression was unnecessary. The underworld was secure, a kingdom shaped by timeless laws. Yet he recognized that the threads of the living world had begun to tangle with the threads of his own dominion. And where threads intersected, the patterns could unravel or reweave themselves anew. Persephone moved with measured steps, her awareness expanding as she navigated corridors and chambers of stone that seemed alive with memory. The shadows shifted around her, acknowledging her presence without dominating it. She observed the dead not with fear, but with quiet fascination, noting the way they drifted like leaves in a stream, each carrying the essence of a life once lived. In her, the underworld sensed a vitality unknown to its halls, a force that would transform both the living and the dead. Hades, sitting upon his throne of obsidian, felt the subtle shifts that her presence induced. The rivers flowed differently, slower and more deliberate, as though accommodating the balance of life she brought. Cerberus, ever vigilant, softened his gait, his 3 heads turning gently to watch her movements without intimidation. The air itself seemed less oppressive, carrying a faint sense of anticipation. The quiet of eternity had not been broken. It had been altered, reshaped, made responsive. Above, the world continued to weaken. Crops withered, and animals grew restless, sensing the imbalance in forces beyond their comprehension. Mortals prayed, but the heavens offered no guidance. Demeter, goddess of harvest, wandered through her dominion like a storm of grief made flesh, her sorrow bending the land itself. She felt each leaf that failed to sprout, each river that refused to run, as though the world's pulse had slowed to a halt. The Olympians convened again, considering the necessity of intervention. Zeus, aware of the fragile state of mortals, understood that compromise was inevitable. Hades' sovereignty over the underworld was absolute. The laws of death could not be violated lightly. Yet even he could perceive the need for adjustment, for equilibrium. Persephone's presence had altered the cycles, and the threads of balance demanded delicate handling. Hermes was chosen to act as intermediary, moving between the realms with the swiftness and neutrality only a messenger of the gods could command. Hades felt his approach before the first mortal sound could reach the underworld, for in his realm, all motion resonated through stone and shadow. The messenger did not disturb the stillness. He acknowledged it, carrying with him the weight of compromise. Persephone, aware of the first tentative approach of another presence, felt curiosity mingled with caution. She had begun to comprehend the order of the underworld, the structure of endings, and the quiet intelligence that governed every movement. The halls no longer seemed alien. They seemed alive, shaped by unseen currents that guided both living and dead. And now, for the first time, the world above sought to influence her path. Hades observed, silent and unyielding, as the negotiations, though not yet begun in words, were carried in essence through movement, presence, and awareness. His domain was not a battlefield. It was a testament to patience permanence and inevitability. Yet even permanence could not resist subtle transformation. The arrival of Persephone had brought with it an element of life that could not be ignored. Within the halls, the dead sensed the change. They shifted, moved, and observed, though they could not speak. Even they recognized that the natural order had been touched by something unexpected. The corridors seemed longer, yet warmer. The shadows darker, yet not oppressive. The underworld, for the first time in centuries, had acknowledged the presence of life in its midst without dissolving its own purpose. Hades reflected on the nature of choice and consequence. He had not abducted Persephone out of malice, nor had he acted recklessly. His motives were subtle, shaped by inevitability, yet they had consequences that rippled far beyond the thresholds of his kingdom. Above, the world withered. Below, a new life of awareness emerged. The interplay of existence and eternity was laid bare, revealing the delicate balance between realms. As the days, or what passed for days, in the timeless underworld continued, Persephone learned the rhythms of this strange domain. She came to understand that death, though silent and absolute, was not void. It was a mirror of life, a continuation in stillness rather than motion. Hades observed this awakening with patience, recognizing that even in a god of shadows, the stirrings of connection could awaken understanding, a comprehension of the delicate weave of existence. The world above remained in turmoil, yet the seeds of resolution had been planted. Persephone's dual existence was inevitable, though neither realm could yet fully perceive it. The living required balance, and the dead had already begun to show that their silence could accommodate life's subtle influences. Hades' own solitude, long absolute, now contained the first faint echoes of recognition that the realm of endings could coexist with the emergence of beginnings. And so the first phase of understanding unfolded, delicate and invisible. Mortals struggled, gods observed, and the underworld began its slow adaptation. Persephone moved through corridors of stone and shadow, her presence quietly transforming every corner. Hades remained, watching and waiting, aware that the course of history was bending inexorably toward resolution, toward compromise, and toward the subtle harmony that only eternity could sustain. Time in the underworld was a river without beginning or end, yet within its stillness, subtle currents moved. Persephone began to sense them, a rhythm beneath her feet, a whisper within the stones, a faint pulse in the silent air. She was no longer merely a visitor in this realm. She was becoming an intrinsic part of its balance, a presence whose awareness shaped the behavior of the shadows and the rivers alike. Even Cerberus, whose vigilance was eternal, seemed to recognize her as more than intruder, more than guest, as queen in waiting. Hades observed her with a patience cultivated over eons. His gaze did not intrude upon her privacy, yet it was present, steady and unyielding. He did not intervene unnecessarily, for he understood the power of natural growth, whether in mortals, immortals, or gods themselves. Persephone's movements, her gestures, the quiet deliberation in her eyes, each revealed to him a mind awakening to the complexities of life and death, light and shadow. In these silent observations, he saw the emergence of balance, the shaping of a ruler who would unite two worlds without diminishing either. The rivers of the underworld flowed more distinctly in response to her presence. Styx, with its solemn gravity, seemed to adjust its course, carrying both echoes of the dead and ripples of life that she brought unknowingly. Lethe, the river of forgetting, seemed to soften, offering solace rather than oblivion. Hades understood that the underworld was not fixed. It could respond, adapt, and even flourish when touched by the right force. Persephone was that force. Above, the earth continued to feel the absence of the goddess of harvest. Mortals struggled to survive under the weight of famine, and Demeter's sorrow persisted, heady and unyielding. Yet even within despair, a faint glimmer of hope remained. The Olympians, observing from afar, realized that resolution would not be imposed, but negotiated. The threads of fate, though tangled, were not beyond repair, and the first interventions, subtle and indirect, began to take shape, guided by Hermes' careful hand. Persephone herself began to internalize the rhythm of her dual existence. Though separated from the sun and the fields she had once known, she sensed that she was not a mere captive. The underworld, in all its permanence and shadow, responded to her presence with a quiet deference. Her understanding grew, not as knowledge forced upon her, but as insight discovered in silent observation. She recognized patterns, sensed cycles, and began to intuit the subtle currents of power that existed within this domain. Hades, watching, felt an unfamiliar stirring within himself. He had known solitude for eons. He had known the cold permanence of rule. Yet in observing Persephone, he understood that even a god of shadows could experience the faint tremors of anticipation, of recognition, of connection. He did not act impulsively. He never acted without thought. But he allowed himself to acknowledge the inevitability of change, the necessity of adaptation, and the subtle awakening of what might be called care. The halls of the underworld responded to their silent interplay. Shadows stretched to accommodate her, guiding without imposing. The stones, ancient and unmoved, seemed to tilt slightly, creating paths that mirrored her curiosity and contemplation. Even the silent souls, drifting in perpetual memory, adjusted their course, a testament to the influence of presence over eternity. Hades recognized that his realm was alive, not in the sense of chaos, but in the sense of potential. And Persephone had become the catalyst of that potential. The tension between the living and the dead, though still palpable, began to soften. Demeter's grief remained a force of immense power, yet the faintest signs of restoration began to emerge. Streams, slow and hesitant, found new channels. Seeds, stubborn and dry, began to swell under the influence of a supple energy that filtered from below. Mortals, though unaware of the complex negotiation of realms, felt the first hints of relief. The world above and the realm below were beginning, slowly, to resonate with one another once more. Hades reflected on the nature of permanence and impermanence. His domain was eternal, yet eternity was not static. It's shaped by patterns, by cycles, by the interplay of forces both seen and unseen. Persephone was not merely a visitor. She was a necessary component in this eternal design. Through her, the underworld was learning to breathe with life, while life above was beginning to understand the weight and necessity of death. The subtle shift in power began to manifest in Persephone herself. No longer merely frightened or curious, she began to feel authority in her own right. Not dominance, but presence. Not control, but recognition. She understood that her role extended beyond mere survival or existence. She was becoming a bridge between realms, a living emblem of balance that both the dead and the living could acknowledge. And in this, Hades saw the faint glimmer of a harmony that had never existed before. The cycles of the underworld responded to this balance. Shadows bent to form paths. Rivers slowed and swirled in deliberate rhythms. The silent dead drifted in patterns of alignment, no longer completely at random. Even Cerberus, eternal and vigilant, walked without the rigid tension of unbroken routine, attuned to the subtle rhythm Persephone brought. Hades observed all, patient, deliberate, his awareness encompassing the vast silent kingdom and the threads of the world above. The underworld, eternal yet transformed, was learning the rhythm of duality. And so, in the midst of silence and shadow, of rivers and stones, of eternal watchfulness, the first lessons of partnership unfolded. Persephone grew in awareness and presence, Hades in patience and perception. Above, the world awaited her return, its vitality dependent on the careful weaving of fate. The balance, once to stir, was beginning to realign, guided not by force, but by understanding, recognition, and the inevitable flow of destiny itself. In the silent halls of the underworld, time flowed in a rhythm distinct from that of the living world. Days and nights held no meaning, yet moments were marked by subtle changes. The shift of shadows, the quiet movement of rivers, the measured steps of Persephone. She had begun to navigate her surroundings with increasing confidence, understanding not just the physical terrain, but the essence of the realm itself. Hades observed her from his throne, unintrusive yet vigilant, noting every step, every pause, every glance. He had not known companionship in countless eons. His domain had been complete, yet lonely. And now, through the presence of Persephone, he found a force that did not diminish his authority, but complemented it. Her awareness reshaped the halls subtly, the corridors responding to her curiosity and quiet power. Even the dead, who had long drifted in predictable silence, began to shift their paths in deference to her presence, creating a new, flowing pattern within eternity. The rivers of the underworld reflected her essence. Styx, dark and eternal, no longer carried only the weight of oaths and inevitabilities. It carried a delicate rhythm of life, a subtle pulse that intertwined with the natural flow of memory and death. Lethe, the river of forgetting, softened around her, allowing space for reflection, comprehension, and quiet growth. Hades understood that her arrival had created a harmony within his domain that had never existed before, an alignment of inevitability and potential. Above, the world still bore the consequences of absence. Demeter's grief persisted, her sorrow shaping the land itself. Crops were slow to respond, rivers moved sluggishly, and mortals whispered prayers that reached only the empty air. Yet even in this disruption, faint traces of resilience emerged. The gods recognized that the solution required delicate handling. The threads of fate had been disturbed, but they were not irreparable. The living and the dead, the eternal and the temporal, would have to find a new balance. Persephone's understanding of the underworld deepened with each passing cycle. She learned to read the currents of shadows, the subtle murmurs of the rivers, and the gentle guidance of those souls who had accepted their endings. This realm, once foreign and frightening, had begun to feel like a place of learning and reflection rather than confinement. Hades observed this transformation silently, aware that the growth she experienced would shape the future of both their worlds. Their relationship, though silent, began to develop through presence alone. Hades did not speak. Persephone did not speak. Yet through observation and awareness, a mutual comprehension took root. She recognized his fairness and restraint, his unwavering adherence to the laws of the underworld. He recognized her insight, curiosity, and growing understanding of life, death, and the delicate balance between them. Words were unnecessary. The exchange existed in the rhythm of their coexistence. The underworld itself seemed to respond to this newfound equilibrium. Shadows adjusted their reach, guiding Persephone without constraint. The rivers flowed with a more deliberate cadence, carrying both echoes of the dead and hints of life above. Cerberus, eternal sentinel, adapted his patrols to her presence, walking with a subtle attentiveness that acknowledged her emerging authority. Even the stones and walls, ancient and immovable, seemed to tilt slightly, forming pathways and spaces aligned with her movements. Hades contemplated the nature of transformation. Though his domain had always been permanent, it was not immune to change. Presence, awareness, and understanding could shape even eternity. Persephone was the first force to awaken this subtle shift, not by overt action, but by simply being. Her influence, gentle yet powerful, created a bridge between life and death, mortality and eternity, shadow and light. Above, the world continued its slow recovery. Mortals felt faint relief as subtle energies from below began to permeate the land. Rivers regained partial flow. Seeds, previously dormant, showed signs of swelling. Though famine had not ended, the first hints of restoration whispered through the fields and forests. Demeter's sorrow remained, heavy and persistent, but even she could sense the nascent rhythm returning, a signal that resolution was possible. Within the underworld, Persephone grew in confidence. No longer merely a guest, she began to embrace the role of observer and participant, understanding that her presence carried weight not just for the dead, but for the living above. Hades, ever patient, continued his silent guidance, ensuring that the balance of the realm was maintained, while allowing her the freedom to learn, to adapt, and to grow. In this slow, deliberate exchange, the first elements of partnership emerged. Neither dominated, neither was subservient. Instead, they moved in harmony, the subtle dance of awareness and influence that allowed both realms to begin adjusting to the new reality. The living and the dead, the eternal and the temporal, were entwined, and the course of events now depended not only on inevitability, but on the choices and comprehension of those who existed within and between both worlds. Thus, the underworld, once silent and immutable, had begun to pulse with a quiet life of its own. Shadows, rivers, stones, and souls all shifted imperceptibly in response to Persephone's presence and Hades' observant guidance. Above, the world waited, poised between collapse and renewal. The stage was set for cycles of seasons, the rhythms of life and death, and the eventual return of the goddess of spring to the surface. Balance, once disrupted, was beginning its slow restoration, guided by awareness, patience, and the inexorable flow of fate itself. The underworld had begun to breathe in response to Persephone. Not literally, for stone and shadow do not breathe as mortals do. Yet there was a rhythm, subtle and undeniable, that pulsed through the rivers, the corridors, and the ancient halls. The presence of life in a place defined by endings had awakened something even Hades had not anticipated. A resonance. It was quiet, measured, and profound. A gentle assertion that the realm, though eternal, could be touched by understanding and growth. Persephone walked these halls with increasing assurance. The silence no longer weighed upon her, nor did the shadows intimidate. She sensed the rhythms of the underworld as if listening to an unseen music. The cadence of inevitability intertwined with hints of life. Each step she took was deliberate, informed by observation and reflection. She had become a force within the realm, not imposed but recognized, and her influence began to shape the environment in subtle ways. Hades observed, seated upon his obsidian throne, unchanging, yet aware of the smallest adjustments in his kingdom. Cerberus walked silently at his side, vigilant, yet softened by the presence of the goddess of life. The rivers, long, steady, and solemn, now carried minor ripples, adjusting their flow to reflect the balance she introduced. The dead, sensing a shift, moved with a faint, almost imperceptible alignment, forming patterns of quiet order that had not existed before. Through this subtle transformation, Persephone began to understand the extent of her influence. She realized that her presence was not merely tolerated, but integrated into the structure of the underworld itself. Shadows guided her without force. Stones shifted to create paths where curiosity led, and the river's currents responded to her steps. Even silence carried meaning. It communicated awareness, expectation, and acknowledgement. In this realm of endings, she had discovered a new beginning, a place where understanding could shape eternity without violating it. Above, the mortal world remained fragile, yet the faintest hints of life began to re-emerge. Streams flowed more fully. Buds swelled in response to subtle energies filtering upward from the underworld. Though Demeter's grief continued, it had been tempered by the gentle movement of balance taking root. Zeus and the other Olympians watched with careful restraint, aware that the resolution must respect the sovereignty of Hades, while allowing the necessary restoration of the surface world. The first conscious recognition between Hades and Persephone deepened. Words were not necessary. Presence and observation were sufficient. Hades understood her growing awareness and adaptability. Persephone recognized his fairness, patience, and the profound weight of his responsibility. Together, through unspoken comprehension, they began to shape a partnership, one not founded on domination or submission, but on the mutual acknowledgement of roles, powers, and responsibilities. Persephone began to explore the edges of her newfound authority. She tested the rivers, walked the corridors with intention, and observed the patterns of the dead. In doing so, she discovered the subtle influence she could exert, not as a ruler in the conventional sense, but as a guide, a presence whose awareness shaped the flow of the underworld. Hades, recognizing her insights, allowed her autonomy, providing only guidance when necessary. This balance, delicate and unprecedented, laid the foundation for a new era in the realm of shadows. The days, or what passed for days, passed in a pattern of growth and reflection. Persephone's understanding expanded, and Hades' awareness deepened. He observed the rhythm of her learning, the development of her presence, and the way she could navigate not only the physical space of the underworld, but also the subtle currents of influence and balance. In her, he saw the embodiment of continuity, the bridge between life and death, light and shadow. The underworld responded to this subtle harmony. Rivers adjusted their flow. Corridors realigned their shadows, and even Cerberus's vigilance softened further, attuned to her authority and presence. The dead, sensing the delicate balance, moved in patterns of quiet recognition, acknowledging her without speech or gesture. Hades noted the profound transformation of his realm. A place once solely of endings, now infused with subtle life, tempered by awareness, respect, and understanding. Above, the mortal world began to reflect the slow restoration of balance. Crops began to sprout cautiously, rivers regained partial flow, and the whisper of growth was felt in forests and fields. The famine did not vanish entirely, but its intensity lessened. The world above, though still fragile, could sense that the underworld, through Persephone, had begun to align with life once more. Even Demeter, in her divine grief, perceived the subtle threads of renewal, faint yet undeniable. In the stillness of the underworld, Hades considered the nature of power and responsibility. Authority, he understood, was not merely domination. It was the careful observation and guidance of forces beyond comprehension. Persephone had begun to embody that principle within his realm. Through her presence, the cycles of life and death, the eternal and the temporal, could find a supple alignment. The underworld, once an unchanging dominion of endings, had begun to breathe in response to understanding, awareness, and the quiet influence of a mortal transformed into a queen. And so, the new rhythm settled in the halls of shadows. Persephone moved with intent and insight. Hades observed with patience and vigilance, and the underworld, ancient and eternal, adapted subtly yet irrevocably. The delicate interplay and presence and awareness had begun, creating a harmony that would shape the balance of worlds above and below for ages to come. The underworld had begun to shift in subtle ways, responding not only to the inevitable passage of the dead, but to the presence of life that Persephone carried with her. Her understanding of the realm's rhythms deepened daily, and with each observation, each interaction, she carved a space of quiet influence. Shadows adjusted instinctively to her steps. Rivers altered their flow imperceptibly, and the walls themselves seemed to accommodate her curiosity. She had grown into the role the underworld had not demanded, but recognized, that of a guide, a mediator, and in time, the queen. Hades watched this transformation with a vigilance tempered by centuries of solitude. He did not intrude, he did not direct. He allowed her to navigate, to test the boundaries, and to awaken her own understanding. Yet even in this restraint, he sensed the emergence of a presence that would redefine the underworld itself. Persephone was learning to balance curiosity with respect, influence with subtlety, and life with the inevitability of death. The rivers, long carriers of silent judgment and memory, responded to her growing mastery. Styx, somber and unwavering, shifted its flow to accommodate the awareness she now commanded. Lethe softened further, providing space for reflection and comprehension rather than complete forgetting. Even Cerberus, eternal sentinel, attuned his vigilance to her authority, acknowledging the subtle dominance of presence without threat. The underworld, ancient and unyielding, began to respond to the emergence of leadership unlike any it had witnessed before. Above, the surface world had begun its slow recovery. Fields, though still fragile, showed signs of life. Streams began to run again, though hesitantly, and the air carried the faint scent of renewal. Mortals whispered prayers of hope, sensing change even if they could not comprehend its source. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, felt the faint stirrings of alignment, a subtle easing of the grief that had so deeply scarred the land. Zeus and the Olympians, observing from above, recognized that restoration would require patience and respect for the sovereignty of Hades and the emergent influence of Persephone. Persephone's understanding of her role continued to grow. She realized that her presence in the underworld did not merely shape the flow of the dead, but also had profound consequences for the living. She learned to navigate with intent, to act with subtle influence, and to recognize the weight of each choice. Hades, patient and ever observant, allowed her this autonomy, providing guidance only when necessary, and always with careful consideration of the balance between his domain and hers. The first conscious coordination between the two realms began to emerge. Through observation alone, they moved in silent collaboration. Hades' knowledge of endings informed Persephone's understanding of beginnings, while her insight into life and vitality tempered his absolute permanence. Together, they created a bridge between worlds, an invisible yet tangible thread linking the living and the dead. This thread would, in time, define the rhythms of mortality and eternity alike. Within the underworld, Persephone's presence inspired subtle adjustments in the structure of the realm. Corridors aligned more intuitively with movement. Shadows provided guidance rather than concealment, and rivers flowed with a nuanced cadence that reflected both memory and life. The dead, sensing the balance she introduced, shifted their movements to mirror it, creating patterns that suggested order and harmony rather than aimless wandering. The underworld, silent and eternal, was learning the influence of life through her quiet authority. Hades reflected on the nature of connection and responsibility. His domain, while absolute in its permanence, was not immune to subtle change. Persephone's growth and understanding offered a new model of governance, one that blended inevitability with awareness, silence with influence, and permanence with adaptability. Through her, the underworld discovered the capacity for subtle harmony, a resonance that had never existed before. Above, the world responded in kind. Mortals felt the first tentative return of bounty. Crops began to sprout, rivers regained strength, and the air carried a whisper of hope. Though famine and grief had left scars, life had begun to reclaim its rhythm. Demeter, sensing the influence of her daughter and the careful balance maintained by Hades, began to channel her sorrow into a quiet patience. She understood that the restoration of the surface world required acknowledgement of the underworld's sovereignty and the emergence of Persephone as a force of mediation. In the silent corridors of the underworld, Persephone's transformation continued. She moved with purpose, guided by awareness and intuition. Shadows, rivers, stones, and even the silent dead adapted to her influence, creating a dynamic yet balanced environment. Hades, watching from his eternal vantage, recognized the delicate alignment of power and presence that had taken root. The underworld, once solely a realm of endings, now held the potential for guidance, continuity, and subtle life. And so the stage was set for the final reconciliation. Persephone, now aware of her authority and role as a bridge between worlds, would begin to exercise influence with both insight and restraint. Hades, eternal and steadfast, would continue to observe and guide, his presence a foundation upon which balance could be maintained. The underworld had transformed, subtly yet profoundly, under the quiet stewardship of life's influence and death's vigilance. Balance, long disrupted, was approaching restoration. The threads of fate, woven across two realms, were aligning in anticipation of the final harmonization. The living and the dead, the mortal and the eternal, were beginning to exist in coordination once more, guided by awareness, respect, and the inexorable flow of destiny. The underworld, long, eternal, and unchanging, had begun to breathe with the subtle rhythm of life. Persephone had embraced her role, no longer merely a visitor, but a presence of authority and awareness. She moved with intent, her steps shaping shadows, rivers, and corridors with an elegance born of understanding and observation. Hades watched, patient, his eternal gaze taking in every nuance, every ripple of change her presence induced. In her emergence as queen, the underworld found a harmony it had never known, a bridge between permanence and adaptation, silence and life. The rivers adjusted their flow to reflect her awareness. Styx carried echoes of the living, interwoven with the memories of the dead, a delicate current of continuity. Lethe softened, offering not mere forgetting, but comprehension, a space where reflection could beat acceptance. Cerberus, vigilant yet now subtly attuned, moved with less rigid precision, acknowledging her influence with each step. Shadows leaned where she leaned, and stones, ancient and unwavering, subtly rearranged to create paths of intuition. Above, the world had begun to heal. Crops pushed upward through the soil, Streams carried water with renewed strength, and forests whispered the tentative return of life. Mortals, sensing a shift in the unseen currents of existence, whispered prayers not of despair, but of hope. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, felt the faint hum of alignment across the lands. She recognized that her daughter's presence in the underworld was not a deprivation, but a necessary bridge for renewal, a force that could restore the rhythm of life without undermining the sovereignty of death. Hades and Persephone existed now in a silent partnership, each aware of the other's strengths, each respecting the boundaries and responsibilities that came with power. Words were unnecessary. Observation, awareness, and understanding sufficed. Persephone's vitality brought balance to his permanence. His steadfastness grounded her emerging authority. Together, they forged a rhythm that united two realms, the living and the dead, light and shadow, beginnings and endings. Within the underworld, the dead sensed this new harmony. Movements became patterned, not arbitrary. Shadows provided guidance. Rivers carried understanding. Even the silent echoes of memory seemed to align, forming an invisible network of order and balance. Hades observed the transformation with measured satisfaction, recognizing that the emergence of awareness and presence in Persephone had not only restored equilibrium, but enriched his realm. The underworld was no longer merely a place of endings. It had become a space where understanding, reflection, and subtle life could coexist. Above, the mortal realm flourished once more. The famine lessened, seeds germinated, rivers ran clear, and the air carried the sense of renewal. Mortals remained unaware of the exact mechanics of the restoration, yet their lives were shaped by it. The gods, long observers of mortal fate, recognized the subtle artistry with which balance had been re-established. Zeus, in his wisdom, understood that the solution had been neither forceful nor violent, but guided by comprehension and harmony. Persephone, fully aware of her dual existence, moved with the grace of one who had embraced her purpose. She was no longer merely the daughter of Demeter. She was the queen of the underworld, the bridge between worlds, the harmonizer of existence. She had learned to influence without imposing, to guide without demanding, and to balance life with inevitability. Her presence shaped not only the realm of shadows, but the world above, ensuring that the cycles of seasons, life, and death could continue without disruption. Hades, observing the quiet mastery she had achieved, felt a subtle shift within himself. He had known eternity, isolation, and the unchanging weight of rule. Yet through Persephone, he experienced a reflection of connection and understanding that had eluded him for millennia. The underworld was enriched, not diminished, by her presence. Its permanence remained, but now it pulsed with the quiet resonance of life aware and accepted within its borders. The subtle harmony they had forged extended beyond immediate awareness. The mortal realm, the cycles of nature, and the flow of souls in the underworld moved in delicate balance. Mortals lived, the dead rested, and the Olympians observed with a quiet satisfaction. The threads of fate, once disrupted, had been reweaved into a pattern of continuity that respected both life and death, impermanence and permanence. And so, The final equilibrium settled. Persephone, confident and aware, held the duality of her existence with wisdom and grace. Hades, eternal and steadfast, maintained his role as guardian, enriched by the presence of the living in his realm. The Underworld, once merely a place of endings, now carried within it a rhythm of understanding, presence, and subtle life. Across worlds, balance endured. The cycles of seasons returned. Rivers ran, crops grew, and mortals lived in harmony with forces they could not always perceive. Death continued its inevitability. Life continued its vitality, and the realms of both existed in unspoken coordination. In the silence of the eternal halls, Hades observed, patient and resolute. Beside him, Persephone moved, aware and purposeful. Together, they had forged a bridge across worlds, a connection between shadow and light, ending and beginning. The Underworld, eternal yet transformed, stood as testament to the power of understanding, patience, and the subtle resonance that can arise when life and death acknowledge one another. And thus, the story of Hades and Persephone, told not through words, but through the quiet interplay of presence, awareness, and responsibility, reached its resolution. Balance, once disrupted, was restored. The living and the dead, the mortal and the eternal, existed in harmony, guided by the rhythm of understanding and the inevitability of destiny. The Underworld endured. The world above flourished, and the two realms, forever linked, continued their eternal dance, shadow and light in quiet equilibrium, overseen by a god of endings and a queen of life reborn within eternity.